Grace and I just watched Sound of Freedom.
I can't put it in words, what I just saw.
Guys, this was the hardest movie I have ever had to watch.
It is a life-altering and life-changing movie.
How dare you people stop this from being seen?
What is going on here? This video is sponsored by Surfshark. That's right, I'm sponsored now. Mama's gotta eat, but more on them in a bit. First, we have a stage to set. Last year, a normal-ass action thriller made 10 times its budget to become one of the highest-grossing movies of 2023. What's that about? Sound of Freedom came out last July 4th, no big deal, which means it's de facto no longer really a new movie. It certainly would have been more algorithmically friendly if I had made this video last summer. Believe me, I tried my best. But I think there's a lot to gain from some distance with a piece like this. So much of the life of a movie has surprisingly little to do with the movie itself. Film is a deeply collaborative art form that involves the coordination of a lot of very different kinds of people, many of whom are more often than not operating with large amounts of both ego and money. This means that the before and after of a film, its conception, its pre-production, production, distribution, marketing, reception, and cultural legacy often, at least in my opinion, end up being more interesting than the movie itself. Entire lives have been built and ruined on the back of one movie that just gets picked up by Tubi for a few months and then forgotten. That's just the kind of thing that happens when you put a bunch of extreme personalities in a room together and tell them to make something. Basically what I'm getting at here is that even if Sound of Freedom weren't part of a political project, it would still be fascinating as a cultural artifact because of what it reveals about everybody who interacts with it. Blockbuster media events are like a prism. Any input of attention or energy, whether by their makers, their marketers, or their audiences, cause this shattering of other effects that would have no clear relationship but for the object at the center of it all. Of course, the fact that Sound of Freedom is part of a political project just adds to the many facets of American society it's able to refract, which I think is the reason so much of the conversation surrounding this movie has so little to do with, the movie. The fancier the designs on the walls are, the easier it is to forget that what we're dealing with here is, in the end, a piece of glass that's only impressive under very specific circumstances. I don't think that's true for any movie more than it's true for Sound of Freedom. So before we talk about the interesting parts, it really is imperative that we sit down and internalize what a dull hunk of rock this movie actually is. First, let's take a second to thank the sponsor of this video. If you spent any length of time watching my videos, you know that if there's anything I don't trust, oh man, it's the internet. I spend a lot of time writing my little words at cafes, and the idea that someone might be virtually snooping over my shoulder cooks my goose to no end. Nobody needs to know I'm researching chimp attacks or torture methods. Mind your business. That's why I never hop on public Wi-Fi unless I've turned on a VPN first, and lately Surfshark has been fitting my needs perfectly. Surfshark keeps your online identity safe by encrypting all the information sent between your device and the internet, keeping your personal data protected from big companies and cyber criminals and wrongdoers of all kinds. Just press a button on any of the unlimited number of devices you're allowed with Surfshark, and you'll get your own encrypted IP address, allowing you to get past geographic restrictions on Netflix so that you can watch your favorite movies and shows not available in your own country's library, access censored content, or just keep your perfectly healthy interest in the history of cannibalism to yourself. And unlike other VPNs, Surfshark doesn't store your data for any length of time. Very important. What's the use of having secrets if someone else has to know them? So click the link in the description or pull up the QR code that should be on the screen right now and use code MORBIDZOO for an extra 3 months of internet privacy for free. Alrighty, so we open on Rocio Aguilar, who is playing music in her room. She's interrupted by a knock on the door, a lady who introduces herself to Rocio's father as Giselle, a talent scout interested in signing Rocio and her brother Miguel up for a modeling agency. Later on, their father Roberto drops the kids off at a photo shoot where Giselle takes their photos. When Roberto comes back, everyone has vanished. We cut to the most cartoonish pedophile in the world posting a database of children onto a forum. But little does he know that outside his house is one of those vans that definitely isn't full of government agents. It is full of government agents. Tim Ballard is there. Tim is in the van. I'm going to be talking about the real Tim Ballard quite a bit here. So to differentiate between movie Tim and real Tim, I'm going to call movie Tim Jim from now on, as in Tim Ballard as portrayed by Jim Caviezel. So Tim, Jim, and friends break into the house and body slam this cartoonish child predator to the ground. Not How That's Done, and find in his house a lot of genuinely stomach-turning photos that I will not be showing here. Back at the station, one of the new kids asks Tim Jim how many children they've found after finding the people exploiting them, and Tim Jim says this.
There's a high probability that most of those kids are outside of the US, Chris. So, our job is to get the pedophiles. And that's it.
Later on, Tim Jim decides, apparently on his own, also not how that's done, to do some kind of undercover type thing by convincing our cartoon pedophile, whose name is Oshinsky, that he too is interested in predating upon children. Over time, he gains Oshinsky's trust, and Oshinsky sets up a meeting with a guy named Earl Buchanan, who has Miguel. After intercepting Miguel, Miguel tells him that his sister is still missing and asks if Tim Jim will find her for him. At this point, we see Miguel's experience, where he's separated from his sister and sent to Mexico for trafficking into the US, while Rocio is sent to Colombia. With tentative approval from his boss, Tim Jim goes to Cartagena, which is the last tip he has from Earl Buchanan. While there, local police send him to a guy known locally only as El Vampiro, who's a sort of Schindler kind of guy who buys children out of sex slavery and sets them free. They have a meeting where he says the thing,
God's children are not for sale.
and Vampiro agrees to work with him. Together, Vampiro and Tim Jim decide to set up an Epstein-type high-roller underage party club. For credibility, he gets a wealthy acquaintance to pose as an investor. Side note, this is actually the movie's producer, Eduardo Verástegui, an ex-telenovela actor who spent the pandemic reciting the rosary for hours on his YouTube channel, which is the most Mexican thing I've ever seen in my life. Holy shit. It's at this point that Tim Jim's boss orders him to come home, that the US has no jurisdiction over what he's doing, and it is now time to either quit the mission or quit his job. So, true to the story reel Tim tells, he has a conversation with his wife in about 35 seconds of Mira Sorvino's combined 2 minutes of screen time, and quits his job to devote himself to finding Rocio. With their fake investor, the team is able to throw around enough money to catch the eye of Giselle, who agrees to bring a bunch of kids to an island where the successful sting operation is set up, saving dozens of kids.
Hear that? That's the sound of freedom.
He said it. That's the title of the movie. When the Colombian police interrogate the traffickers from the island, Tim Jim learns that Rocio was sold to a leader of one of the rebel groups in the jungle. Posing as medical personnel, he and Vampiro head into the region on a boat where they are separated. Tim Jim's gonna have to go this one alone. He's tolerated in the rebel camp for long enough to find Rocio, kill the rebel leader who bought her, and escape. And so it is that the Aguilar family is reunited, and Rocio returns to her bedroom to play music once again. Over the credits, we're shown footage of the real island raid and told of the real Tim's work in helping pass law enforcement cooperation laws with foreign countries. We're also told of the scale of human trafficking and child sex, and the movie leaves us with the statistic that there are more people in slavery now than in the history of legal slavery put together. There's also a very special message, but we'll get to that later. So the general reaction to this movie thus far has gone like this. Typical media outlets, recognizing that what they have on their hands here is propaganda of some kind, review the movie through that lens, thinking that if they warn people what they're getting into, maybe audiences will think twice about spending their money on what is quite obviously an ideological project for the right. The right, in response, correctly points out that reviewers are being selectively critical about this movie just because of who made and distributed it. That this is just a movie about a man saving children. Anyone should be able to get behind that idea, so if the left doesn't want you to see it, it must be saying something pretty profound. This then allows the right to appeal to the kind of conspiracy that is rampant right now, where the cognitive environment of just asking questions results in baseless claims that Sound of Freedom is being banned, that theaters are sabotaging showings, the kind of thing that might not be true in practice, but everyone knows the leftist elite don't want you to see this movie anyway, so it might as well be true in spirit. In any case, the result is that right out the gate, the conversation about the movie begins at a place other than the movie itself, which I think is a losing strategy when countering what this movie is being used to say. But this is tricky, because even talking about the movie itself can yield some unhelpful results. Sound of Freedom has the kind of weird vibe that critics love, because it allows them to use phrases that don't really apply to anything else. Phrases like breathtakingly dreary and thunderously crass. Unfortunately, writing reviews about bad movies is really fun, which means that critics can sometimes inflate the badness of a movie to serve their own navel-gazing creative expression, which is why everyone hates movie critics. I myself think these reviews are overblown. In my opinion, Sound of Freedom is neither breathtaking nor thunderous in any regard. Its main issue, more than anything, is just a problem of tone. I appreciate what director Alejandro Monteverde is trying to do here. The needle he's trying to thread is extremely small. He needs to make a story about child trafficking where the action is exciting and effective, but which doesn't undercut the darkness of the subject matter. In this ambition, I think he mostly fails. Though I commend his obvious intention to aesthetically make child abduction and exploitation as ominous and sickening as it is, I don't think he quite balances that darkness out properly with the conventions of the genre he's working within, which is, at the end of the day, an action thriller. There are simply not enough thrills in this thriller. It's just a little too hammy, too saccharine. Where are my thrills, Alexito? Part of the problem here is our star. In an otherwise solid cast, Jim is very much the weakest link. Jim Caviezel was handpicked by Tim Ballard because of his Jesus credentials, but I do not think he is a good choice here. The thing about playing Jesus is that Jesus of Nazareth is one of the only characters in world mythology or literary culture who knows exactly what's happening to him and its thematic importance for the human condition. Typically, this kind of air of omniscience that Jim has is not a desirable quality in an actor, because it dampens the emotional impact of narrative events if your main guy seems completely unsurprised by everything that happens. By far the best moment of Jim's performance, in my opinion, is when he finally finds Rocio. This is the only part where I actually believe the complicated feelings this guy is going through, the tension between his excitement and his need to not blow this delicate situation. At every other point, I feel like the mood wouldn't be at all broken if Jim Caviezel turned to the camera and told me that I too can save a child for only 15 cents a month. Overall, the most flattering word that I think can be honestly applied to Sound of Freedom is operatic. I choose the word operatic partly because that's the word the director himself applies to this work. In an interview with the LA Times, which we'll get more into later, Alejandro Monteverde makes it clear that the goal with this movie was not realism as such. You know the fight at the end. When I arrived the first day, they have rehearsal for 3 days with the stunts and everything, and I saw it. I was like, that looks very real. Guys, I actually want to make it look like an opera. Like if you were watching it as a Broadway show. That was my approach. I want the symbolism of dark and light, that fight. So in that way, good for Monteverde. He accomplished exactly what he set out to make, which is basically a fable. Everybody here is playing the most archetypical version of themselves. Here are the most blameless, innocent children imaginable. Here are our swarthy, sneering villains, our criminal with a heart of gold, and of course, our reluctant hero, who returns home triumphant. It is, above all, intensely formulaic, which is why it got funded and made in the first place. Human trafficking is actually kind of a stock plot device in the United States, which is why it's so bizarre to hear people connected with this movie insist that Hollywood is suspiciously silent on this issue, as though SVU hasn't been on air for 25 years.
Does anyone else find it really interesting how many celebrities have no problem sharing their political affiliations, and yet not a single one of them has mentioned child trafficking? Not a single one of them is in support of the Sound of Freedom, in educating others about trafficking, and yet every single one of them is a parent.
Narratively, Sound of Freedom has itself been made in varying and better forms over and over again. Just off the top of my head, it was made in 2014, 2008, 2005, and 1976. The exact modeling scam Sound of Freedom depicts was in Pen 15 2 years ago. In the early 2000s, child trafficking was the pet issue among Hollywood celebrities, with Ashton Kutcher and Demi Moore making it their chosen philanthropic project.
Real men prefer a close shave. Real men don't buy girls.
The point is that there's nothing particularly special about Sound of Freedom. It was purchased and then sat undistributed by Fox because of nothing more complicated than the company couldn't decide what to do with it. Fox was then bought by Disney, who had even less of an idea what to do with it. There's been a lot of recent news about studios shelving movies indefinitely or canceling them altogether, but the only really weird or new thing about that is that studios are increasingly shelving movies that they themselves made. Studios regularly buy indie films with the intention of meeting creating a projected market that just ends up never materializing. There are right and wrong times to release certain movies, and the industry is intensely aware of and plans for that fact, which means that a lot of independent movies that weren't made with the express intention of meeting a studio's programming goals end up as Plan Bs. And this is all without including the normal industry politics that gunk up the gears and have nothing to do with the movie. People getting fired and other people getting hired in their place. Favors being made or cashed in. Company restructuring, like mergers. Independent filmmakers are aware of this fact too, which is why a lot of independent filmmakers don't expect their movie to see very much financial or popular success. They're artists. They do it because they think movies are important and they love making them. Poor Monteverde believed so much in Sound of Freedom as a project that he gave up his contractual rights to any profits from Sound of Freedom to better guarantee its distribution. Bummer, dude. The traditional form of marketing was just never going to work for this movie. Not because anyone wants to hide it, but just because it's not doing anything particularly new or interesting. In a situation like this, the only strategy you can take is to force the world into a shape that makes it new and interesting. This is where Angel Studios comes in. After Disney let the distribution rights expire for Sound of Freedom, they sold it to Angel Studios, a faith-based company founded by the Harmon brothers, Neil, Jeff, Jordan, Daniel, and also some other guy named Benton Crane. At the time it bought Sound of Freedom from Eduardo Verástegui, Angel Studios had been producing shows on their own platform through a sort of internal Kickstarter strategy. People would donate to the production costs of shows they wanted to see in return for some potential profit down the line if the show did well. After that saw some success and the company grew a little, they decided to branch out into buying already made shows for distribution on their platform. The complete history of Angel Studios is a true American success story that begins with poopery and ends with being sued by Disney. It is a fascinating tale, but one that I don't have time to get into here given all the other stuff I'm already microanalyzing. So if you want the full story, I recommend watching Fundy Friday's account of it. Suffice it to say that the biggest takeaway is that the brothers Harmon are quite literally marketing geniuses. Their skills and talents could not be more perfectly suited to the needs of the companies they've done work for, including their own. What Angel Studios has done is what every corporation dreams of. These motherfuckers have harnessed virality. The thing about virality is that almost by definition, it cannot happen the same way twice. The metaphor of a virus is actually a pretty good characterization of what internet virality is. A virus can't continue to infect a lot of hosts if it stays the same. Eventually, a population inoculates itself through vaccination or death, so viruses are constantly evolving in concert with their target population's immunity, which is why we need a new flu vaccine every year. I paid attention during COVID. Just call me a vaxhole. The thing to internalize here is that viruses don't succeed by coming up with some master strategy of domination that accounts for every contingency at the outset. They do it by responding to the constant informational feedback loop created by the open-air experiment that is the infection itself. What constitutes good conditions for a virus is constantly changing, so viruses are constantly changing. What the Harmon brothers understand about virality that has eluded other companies is that to go viral does not mean controlling cultural fashion, it means being in tune with and responsive to cultural fashion. This makes its religious identity something of a marketing asset. Angel Studios is an activist studio. It has a moral agenda. And that's not like a bad thing. My main criticism of Hollywood as it's structured right now is that it's effectively a corporatocracy, which is not a good way to structure an art industry if the goal is like good art. Artists are very morally driven people. It's okay to have moral ambitions when you're making movies. Like Tim Ballard, the Harmon brothers and Benton are devout Mormons, though unlike Tim Ballard, they're still in good standing with the church. They practice that very particular kind of American Christianity where company growth is equated with moral rectitude. Not quite a prosperity gospel, but certainly working within the idea that facilitating business deals is a perfectly expected and normal way for God to indicate his approval. And it's this attitude that I'd like to bring your attention to in the interviews about this movie, because it's central to the way Sound of Freedom works as a political project. Like, take a look at this clip where Neil Harmon is struck dumb by the glory of the Lord's hand in distributing his mediocre action thriller.
Everybody's saying you cannot launch a movie in July. That's when all the $100 million films are coming out. That's when Indiana Jones comes out, and when in Mission Impossible and Oppenheimer. Can't happen. And so we made a decision, and the following morning, I was woken at 4 a.m. And the words came into my mind. Neil, September 15th is too late. July 4th. If you'll step forward, the doors will be opened.
I'm not saying he's faking it. Quite the opposite. I think part of the reason the Harmon brothers are so good at marketing is because they come at it with great sincerity. I can imagine it's a lot easier to follow through on shit if you believe the success of your company is literally ordained by God. What I am saying is that whether Neil Harmon believes what he's saying is irrelevant to the fact that this is extremely good movie marketing. What the Harmon brothers have done here is alchemy. They have transformed Sound of Freedom from an entertainment industry misfire into a spiritual event. This is the holy grail of all advertisement. You don't convince people to buy your product because of the features it offers. You convince people by implying that buying this thing will fundamentally change their life. That's pretty hard for companies selling baked beans or laundry detergent, but becomes a lot easier if the thing you're selling is the literal concept of salvation itself. I think this will be easier and more fun to illustrate if we compare Sound of Freedom's good marketing structure to a stupid bad one. So let's check in with our boys over at the Daily Wire to learn more. As a reminder, a few years ago, the Daily Wire turned its efforts toward movie production. Their ambition is to create movies that everyone likes, but that also are for conservatives only, that make people more conservative, but also don't tell them what to think at all.
It's the stuff that you want in a movie. You would watch it whether you're conservative or not conservative. You need a place to go where you can see entertainment that is not going to deliberately offend your values, where you can see a movie that is actually going to side with you and against a lot of left-wing tropes.
In this endeavor, they've released several flops that have mainly succeeded in inviting bemusement from conservatives and ridicule from everyone else. Notable productions include Chipchilla, a low-rent ripoff of Bluey that stops short of copyright infringement by a truly nose-hair shaving margin, and Lady Ballers, a recent release that was originally meant to be a documentary until the production crew finally gave up trying to find a group of men willing to pretend to be trans in order to infiltrate women's sports. It turns out that's not something that actually happens.
And I said, you guys should go try out for a bunch of ladies' leagues. And that became not possible because, as it turns out, most ladies' leagues don't allow in actual men. And they weren't willing to go the full distance in terms of what it would require in order to, the actual hormone treatments and everything to play in some of the ladies' leagues. But in any case,
by far their most successful production has been What is a Woman, which is only fiction depending on your perspective, and which doesn't diverge at all from the Daily Wire's pre-fiction brand. Both Angel Studios and the Daily Wire are openly driven by conservative moral values, and both rely mainly on streaming as their distribution model, with some dabbling in theatrical releases. In terms of raw marketing power, the Daily Wire actually has a significant advantage over Angel Studios, which lacks the social media network and reputation the Daily Wire has built over the past decade. But all these movies came and went with little cultural acknowledgement from anyone, while this movie became one of the most profitable independent movies of all time. What happened here? The difference between the two is a matter of how these companies are approaching conservatism as an ideology. In videos about the Daily Wire's foray into film production, the boys of the Daily Wire like to say this.
We want to make content that you want to see, not content that you think you're supposed to see.
I think of this as their mission statement, the driving ethos by which the Daily Wire makes all its stuff. And I don't think Lil Benny or any of the rest of this merry band of doofuses would disagree. The problem is that the Daily Wire's marketing strategy is intellectual. Now hear me out. The Daily Wire premises their media on the existence of a silent majority. The idea that people on the right are actually the reasonable, rational ones, and that woke blue-haired gender ideologues are conquering the media landscape that should rightfully be dominated by the measured, restrained, conservative majority that they imagine constitutes most of American society. The Daily Wire is one of the progenitors of the alt-right, and as such, they have that same sort of breezy arrogance of all those cartoon commentary beasts circa YouTube 2015 that present conservatism as unassailable, a source of all human truth so ironclad ironclad that it doesn't even need defending. This is fine, as long as you don't make anything but vacant claims to facts and logic and gish-gallop over any opposition. Unfortunately, actually making things requires some integrity and vulnerability and consistency of belief. So this is the corner the Daily Wire has painted itself into. They have claimed that their productions are destined for success because they appeal to a moral majority. But sometime in the past few years, they got a little too high on their own supply and forgot that claiming everybody thinks like you is really only useful as a rhetorical device. Because no matter what your ideology is, if you're the spokesperson for it, you represent a pretty concentrated example of devotion. So it's actually pretty unlikely that most people think just like you. Trying to prove this out means you will almost certainly embarrass yourself. Like, you can tell everyone you have a super hot girlfriend who lives in Canada, and that might get you somewhere, but you can't invite your imaginary Canadian girlfriend to prom, and if you try, you're gonna look like a huge dumbass. This is basically what happened when the Daily Wire released Terror on the Prairie, the Gina Carano vehicle designed to stick it to the Disney suits, which has been described by IMDb reviews as boring, dull, and woke.
Watching this movie made me realize a pattern that is forming with Daily Wire movies. They all follow strong, independent female characters who either have to rescue the men who are incompetent or defeat the men who are evil. If I want the feminist messaging, I can go to Hollywood. They have plenty of that.
Fans of the Daily Wire are generally conservative. So why would the Daily Wire think their audience would enjoy a bloodbath of a film? It's extremely violent, gory, foul-mouthed, and just not good. One of the characters is a vicious murderer who quotes scriptures, as if that isn't an offensive trope against Christians, the very people who truly want to support the Daily Wire. It's as if the Daily Wire doesn't truly understand its audience at all.
Yes. It is almost that way, isn't it? Companies like Angel Studios that operate on explicitly faith-based motivations are governed by a much more consistent and therefore effective ontology than the Daily Wire. The world is sinful, and it's the Christian task to save others, which means that conservative media, far from being the superior and dominant force, is always operating with a handicap. This allows them to spin all failures as the work of the devil and all successes into triumphs of the Christian destiny against all odds. Fascism does the exact same thing, which I think is a large part of the reason so many Christians seem so susceptible to fascism. To quote Umberto Eco's essay Ur Fascism, thus by a continuous shifting of rhetorical focus, the enemies are at the same time too strong and too weak. Fascist governments are condemned to lose wars because they are constitutionally incapable of objectively evaluating the force of the enemy. To restate, the reason Christians are always at war with the other is the same reason fascists are, because the enemy always fights dirty. Of course, Satan and his sinners are going to have the upper hand against the godly, just the same as the common folk have no hope against the global financial network of Jewry. This means that unlike the Daily Wire, Angel Studios is not beholden to the expectation that their movies should do well on their own. This is great for them, because Hollywood doesn't hold itself to that expectation either. So much of the Daily Wire's attitude about film is, just like everything else they do, fantasy. It's a king of the babies ideology, where you try and force your preferred reality into existence by pretending it's already true and throwing tantrums until everybody agrees with you. The Daily Wire has thus far failed to convince the film industry that their suits and cigars cosplay should be taken seriously in any way. But Angel Studios behaves much more in line with the existing formula for Hollywood success, because they approach the film market antagonistically. They, like all other massive Hollywood successes, do not assume that the free market is just going to take care of everything and let the cream rise to the top. That's a myth for naive Hollywood LARPers. Movies have to be advocated for, because Hollywood success, more than anything, is about how many eyes you can get to look your way. And unless you have a genuinely game-changing idea, commanding attention requires a lot of money and a lot of coordination. Angel Studios might not have the money to buy thousands of billboards in multiple countries or primetime ad space, but they do have a large network of people who individually have a lot of money. Certainly enough to, say, artificially inflate ticket sales. This is where the pay-it-forward strategy comes in. At the end of the movie, Jim Caviezel appears on screen and earnestly tells you in bedroom tones how this movie can only become the Uncle Tom's Cabin of its generation with your help.
You know, Steve Jobs once said, the most powerful person in the world is the storyteller. Abraham Lincoln credited Harriet Stowe when she wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. This powerful story inspired millions to rise up and fight against slavery. I think we can make Sound of Freedom the Uncle Tom's Cabin of 21st century slavery. We don't have big studio money to market this movie, but we have you, and the baton has now been passed to you. We believe this movie has the power to be a huge step forward toward ending child trafficking, but it will only have that effect if millions of people see it. Feel free to pull out your phones and scan this QR code. We don't want finances to be the reason someone doesn't see this movie, so Angel Studios boldly has set up a Pay It Forward program where you can pay for someone else who might not otherwise see it. If you're able, we invite you to Pay It Forward. Join us and millions of others as we ring Sound of Freedom and hope throughout the world. And just remember this, God's children are not for sale. Thank you.
So here's where we need to shift our understanding of what Sound of Freedom is actually doing as a movie. Angel Studios' approach here is to market this not as an action thriller or even a drama. Sound of Freedom is a protest movie. Like Uncle Tom's Cabin, the point of Sound of Freedom is moral, which is the precise opposite of the Daily Wire's approach. Sound of Freedom is not a movie you'll want to see at all. It's a movie you have to see. What Angel Studios has done here is basically engineer a situation in which the quality of the movie itself doesn't matter. If the movie is good, then so much the better for the filmmakers. How masterful they must be to pack so much cinematic quality into such a heavy topic. If the movie is bad, then who cares? Because this is a protest movie, and so its artistic qualities are automatically unimportant. This isn't just some stupid movie. You're not here to be entertained. You're here to receive a message. As a marketing scheme, this strategy passively labels the movie as existing outside the Hollywood system more effectively than anything Ben Shapiro screeching out of your iPhone has ever been able to manage. The audience of this movie already thinks of Hollywood as godless and money hungry. That's not something they need to be convinced of. By marketing this specifically as a protest story, Sound of Freedom is framed as anti-establishment by default. The Pay It Forward strategy then reaffirms this message by inviting the audience to perform their allegiance to the moral cause of the movie, as well as allowing Angel Studios' large network of equity financiers with deep pockets to goose the ticket numbers by mass buying them. And in case you think I'm being cynical here, we know this is what happened, not only because Angel Studios would be stupid not to do this, but because they regularly state it outright.
They're not just going to angel.com. I've known many people that have gone in and literally bought out all theaters.
Fundy Friday's Sound of Freedom video is great for a lot of reasons, but one thing they did in particular makes me want to enshrine it. Angel Studios used to have a running count of tickets bought on their Pay It Forward page, which they helpfully posted right next to the number of people who bought them. They wisely took this down, but not before Fundy Fridays was able to screenshot it, showing a ratio of almost 60 tickets purchased per person. Whether all those tickets get used is beside the point. If you mass buy tickets and cause a surprise flood of sales, you'll kick off a word of mouth cycle that will spur actual sales, some of which will go on to tickle those numbers further by buying more Pay It Forward tickets, some of which will be used by people who otherwise wouldn't see it at all. That's how I saw it. I wasn't gonna pay for this movie, please. This is a masterclass in astroturfing, manufacturing the optics of genuine support, which honestly is fine with me. What's a little light fraud between friends? After all, the message is what matters here, right? The point is to raise awareness, to propagate it, one could say. The last time I sat in a chair and talked about propaganda, a fair amount of people got on my case for what they saw as my slippery lib twisting of the facts when I said that propaganda as we know it today didn't really exist before World War I, and that our academic understanding of how it works hasn't really been updated since then. I didn't think I'd have to slow things down quite so much for those people, but here we are. So, can anyone tell me what events around the turn of the 20th century might have changed the way propaganda is produced? Why, yes. That's right, we had a massive Comtech revolution. In his book Imagined Communities, Benedict Anderson makes the case that most large political conflicts in recent history can be traced back to literacy. That being able to read is what allowed people to exchange ideas, imagine different possibilities for society, and then demand their inaction. But even after literacy became more widespread, it still retained some barriers to entry. You still have to have access to written material, you still have to have the education to interpret it, and the time to care, which is why most of the New World revolutions of the 18th century were orchestrated not by an uprising of the masses, but by a proportionally small group of upper-class literati. Until Until a couple hundred years ago, the most efficient, widespread dissemination of political thought you could hope for pretty much came down to posters, pamphlets, and political cartoons. But in the late 1800s, the human species gets a couple of new toys, radio and film. And within a few decades, information changes from something you interpret to something you experience. Like, I think people need to keep in mind that before about 100 years ago, barely anybody even knew what the president looked or sounded like, much less his preferred sandwich condiment.
If you got like a spicy mustard or something like that.
All right, I hope you enjoyed that fancy burger, Mr. President.
Film and radio made it so that an idea that could take several book lengths to understand could be distilled to its most impactful emotional qualities in a couple of hours, and furthermore, displayed to hundreds, thousands, millions of people, all of whom are able to experience the show not just as an individual, but as part of an extremely large collective. Most people read books and newspapers on their own, maybe with a few others in the pub or whatever, but you can be assured that everyone in a theater saw the same movie you did, and take note on some level of consciousness of their reactions, hear the gasps and groans, those auditory eye rolls and approvals that let you know the correct social response to have. This commonality of experience, this ability of film to interpret events for you, is what inspired cultural critics of the time to liken movie theaters to the only public institution that had, until that time, been in a position to tell people unilaterally how to interpret a piece of information. Church. I would personally go so far as to say that the most dramatic ideologies to come out of the 20th century, communism and fascism, couldn't have existed without the new propaganda tools allowed them by the existence of film and radio. Some of the earliest and most influential film theory comes straight from Soviet filmmakers tasked with turning this new technology into the most effective propaganda tool possible, and the artistic advances they made in editing are staples of film language to this day. I bring this up because we are now, currently, in the middle of another Comtech revolution, but this time we have barely any theory explaining how social media specifically privileges certain kinds of speech over others. I'm going to suggest one here, where text turns information into something you interpret, and film and radio turn information into something you experience. Social media turns information into something you co-create. The primary innovation of social media is the illusion of decentralization. Social media supplanted traditional journalism by billing itself as a sort of collective unconscious, a near bionic method of accessing instant, pure information that would obviously be distorted if it went through such bureaucratic frivolities as ethics. The promise of social media was that it would democratize public discourse, allow people to communicate with each other unencumbered by the divisions of class, race, gender, education, and geographic location that have heretofore arranged the rules of rhetorical privilege, who is and is not permitted to have a voice. The problem is that removing these signifiers online doesn't remove them in real life. The world is still run on prejudice, on assumptions that the way someone looks or their societal status is indicative of their credibility. And far from dismantling those prejudices, social media has been reinscribing them every second for the better part of the last 2 decades. As Richard Seymour points out in his book, The Twittering Machine, instead of dissolving identity politics, social media has done its very, very best to make identity the only thing that matters. You may not, as a person on the internet, be more complicated than what can be described in a series of nouns, pronouns, and emojis in a Twitter bio, because, as I've said in previous videos, the currency of social media is not truth, it is attention. And attention is very swiftly lost in an environment where everybody's talking at the same time. Sound of Freedom found staunch allies in techno-realists like Elon Musk and Russell Brand, who believe that because social media is crowdsourced, it's somehow immune to manipulation, that the generative nature of social media precludes any attempt to control, influence, or affect it in any way. To these people, the success of Sound of Freedom is just a conversation about cold economics, and because they like to paint themselves as knowledgeable about such things, their analysis always has an air of the self-evident. The establishment Hollywood system doesn't want people to see this movie because they passed on a future hit and now they're salty.
My assumption is that the mainstream media, as with our kind of content, doesn't like the emergence of this type of model. The same way that the mainstream attacked Joe Rogan during coronavirus, obviously opposed the content, but they oppose even the concepts of Joe Rogan. They don't want there to be a Joe Rogan.
And so the reason why they got to come up with all of these things is because the investors and the shareholders are saying, why, Disney, did you give away this asset that is now flipped But then you have this other asset that came out around the same time, Indiana Jones, $300 million budget that we're going to lose $200+ million on.
The people who make this argument are stupid. It's an argument that relies on Sound of Freedom being in any way a remarkable movie in its own right, which it isn't, and more to the point is weirdly dismissive of the immense amount of work Angel Studios did on behalf of it. The things communication technologies can't say are often just as, if not more important than the things they can say. FDR benefited as much from radio's ability to put him in the living room of every listening American for his fireside chats to encourage the war effort, as he did from the heavily staged nature of the young film industry to hide his wheelchair. So what can social media not say? Well, much of what it can't say is built into the purported virtues of the system. It can't tell you for certain what someone's class, age, race, gender, or education is. It also occludes geographical location. It also has a serious, almost combative relationship to the idea of archiving. It de-emphasizes what people have said in the past as a matter of standard practice, which results in this overwhelming feeling that the world of social media is a world in which there has never been a past and will never be a future, only a deafening, oppressive, unceasing present. Because social media platforms need people to use them as often as possible, it's also a communication environment where notoriety is equated with success, often financial success. Social cohesion is based on identity, so if fame is a virtue, then identity performance also becomes a virtue, regardless, and this is important, regardless of how consistent it is. The opportunity cost of posting a tearful review of Sound of Freedom is extremely low in a communication environment that doesn't require you to prove your actual commitment to anything. This means that online, the success of the movie becomes its own moral issue because of what the success of the movie means for the identity performance of whoever's talking about it. The issue is no longer about child trafficking. It's about how child trafficking can allow you to market yourself.
Get ready with me to go to the movies, and let's also talk about the movie I'm going to see. It's hotly debated, hotly controversial, which is Sound of Freedom.
Praying for all the children out here. I'm praying for the children that haven't found their way home yet.
Angel Studios co-opted this effect wholeheartedly because it's good for the movie if people say nice things about the movie. The problem they've decided to ignore is that this is a situation that almost can't help but produce conspiracist thinking. The parameters they've purposefully established for discourse about this movie offer two options. Either you like the movie and therefore care deeply about child trafficking, or you dislike the movie and therefore don't care about children at all. Why don't you care about children? Are you trafficking children? No spokesman for the movie makes this distinction clearer than white Jesus himself, Jim Caviezel. After watching hours of interviews and press tours for this movie, the conclusion I've come to is that Jim Caviezel is insane. He is absolutely corn cobs, okay?
Do you really think Biden is the president of the United States? Do you really think he's running our country? Who is it? The central banks, the IMF, the ECB, the private West central banks, the BIZ, the Rothschild banks? We have a Rothschild Pope. A couple years ago, I'm on talking about adrenochrome. You can't say that word.
Jim Caviezel is one of those guys who thinks his personal feelings are all divine inspirations. Everything he says sounds like he's improving lines for a movie about a man named Jim and his valiant campaign against sin.
We're in a, I would say, an apocalyptic moment right now.
This is actually really funny sometimes because Jim will spend a bunch of time building a dramatic moment for himself, and then he actually has to interact with someone else and the rhythm just gets completely goofed by its clash with reality.
Boy, if that was going on at this moment, if we had a film like this, it would have really hurt the Nazis, I'll tell you. But you'll have a movie like this soon. And then there'll be a big question asked of you. What did you do? And many will have nowhere to hide. Look, I'm not the good
Jim. Hang on. I'm gonna go to break.
Jim is the unabashed driver of most of the conspiracist talk surrounding this movie, with producer Eduardo Verástegui occasionally performing as a more polished understudy.
Why is it being called a fantasy? Why is it saying you're going to get brain worms, metaphorically speaking?
Unless they're pedophiles.
Unless, I don't know, I don't have an evidence. You have an evidence? I don't have an evidence, but maybe
I don't know.
they're involved in the crime. Maybe, I don't know.
It's through Jim that we begin to understand how unimportant the movie actually is to this conversation. The more in the weeds I got in these press interviews, the more it seemed like the narrative being created around it almost depends on you not seeing the movie, because the things that people were implying are in the movie just aren't at all. If I had to guess, I'd say that this is why at a certain point in the press tour, Alejandro Monteverde begins to disappear from the party crew. He was no longer participating in the promotion of his own movie. In August, he did that interview with the LA Times where he makes it pretty clear that he still doesn't know how to feel about this whole thing. When I started seeing that develop in front of me, my first instinct was to distance myself from it. I don't want to be part of anything that falls in the area of politics. So when I started seeing division, my first instinct was to run. I'm from Mexico, and I didn't arrive to be part of a divided country. And I don't like to judge people because we all have our own way of thinking. Those interviews that you're mentioning, that's a different way of thinking than mine. I want to respect it, but I also don't want to be a part of it. So I'm going to distance myself, and that's what I did. But then later I realized by distancing myself, the whole story wasn't coming to light. Imagine making a movie about child trafficking and thinking it's possible to stay out of politics. What Monteverde didn't understand about his generous new distribution partner is that protest stories are inherently political, and therefore propagandistic by nature. The Harmon brothers know this, obviously, because it was their idea. They couldn't stop Jim Caviezel from saying kooky shit even if they wanted to. He carries so much clout in the fundamentalist Christian and tradcath worlds that they must stay on his good side regardless of what he says. I guarantee you any Christian media outlet is going to be more eager to invite Jesus Christ to be interviewed than some director with a Spanish accent. I found this video of Neil interviewing Jim and Monteverde, and I had it open. Here's the screenshot, and I'm so sad because the day I tried to download it, they took it down. I've never felt such archival grief. It was so good. Jim is being so insane, and Neil and Monteverde keep trying to gently guide him away from politics, and at one point, Neil thanks Monteverde for making this movie specifically as a Mexican man, because Mexico is the biggest child exploitation provider, and that's a really weird moment. But I think if I really had to guess, I'd say they took it down because at one point, Jim says that parents who have their kids stolen would, quote, probably lay down their life for that child, and we've had to lay down our lives for this movie. Go fuck yourself, Jim Caviezel. The only real anchor Sound of Freedom has to credibility is Tim Ballard himself. Tim was very involved in the promotion of this movie. Unusually for the subject of a biopic, Tim Ballard put himself front and center in press interviews for Sound of Freedom, which as far as I can tell took place while he was still the acting CEO of Operation Underground Railroad. Tim is a great marketer in his own right. He looks like an action star, and he is, if nothing else, extremely passionate about what he does. It's when we start talking about the reason for this passion of his that things start to get a little complicated. To illustrate, Tim fancies himself a sort of amateur historian. He's written a series of books called the Hypothesis series, which posits a daring academic contention. What if we looked at history not in terms of how our current conditions came to be, but in terms of how closely it reflects the Mormon prophecy for the gathering of God's people in America?
Discovery of America, Christopher Columbus. The Pilgrims coming to the land. George Washington and the Revolution. What this book really is showing how history corroborates the scriptures of the Restoration.
Provocative stuff. Tim has a whole PR machine for this series, and on its website you can sign up for access to the little docuseries Tim did on his book The Pilgrim Hypothesis, which you know I did, how could I not? And what I found was interesting. Tim is not a stupid guy. He has at least more than one thought clattering around in his head, which is certainly more than I can say for some people involved in this movie. Tim's understanding of historical fact is not usually incorrect. It's in his interpretation that things start to get a little funky. Let's consider his visit to Plymouth, Massachusetts, where Tim learns about the friendship between the Pilgrims and the local nations.
One of the most interesting things that I discovered was the truth behind the relationship between the Mayflower Pilgrims and the Native Americans. Today's politics and society, people are looking for just cheap shots. They're looking to push certain agendas. They feel like desecrating the memory of the Pilgrims will help them in their racial battles today. And the truth is so much different. You can read the words of pilgrims like Edward Winslow, who write glowingly of the natives and the respect. They did not believe themselves superior. And then others came later, and later migrations to America, and were very abusive to the native populations. And that's tragic, and it was wrong. But it was not the precedent setters, these forerunners to the restoration that were called of God, that were seen by Nephi, that special group, that chosen group that came across on the Mayflower. They were different. They set the standard that others failed to live, and they still are the standard. And they set the example for us to then follow, and unfortunately we haven't followed it. But the worst thing we can do now is trash on that beautiful contract and that beautiful relationship. Instead, we should uphold it and bring it to light and set it forth as the standard, that we might use that today to deal with some of our problems, instead of covering it up and assigning something to that's not true. The true covenant on this land was largely based on the relationship between the natives and the pilgrims, and it's time to resurrect the truth of what that was.
So basically what Tim is saying here is that the initial relationship between the natives and the first English colonists is a plot point, an inciting narrative event in the story of America. He believes that the peace treaty between the Wampanoag and the English settlers is the moment that establishes the theme of love and friendship in the American story. And because Tim believes this, we should all understand Native American history as being about love and friendship with colonists, and not about the abject slaughter and genocide that followed most Native interactions with colonial powers. I know I said the movie doesn't really have much to do with the ideological conversation it's inspired, but I do think there's a quirk about the plot that's worth talking about, which is that there's not much of a character arc. Part of the reason this movie feels pretty unremarkable, even as a thriller, is that Tim Jim kind of starts out fine and ends up fine. His values are never challenged. He rises to every occasion. Really, this should be Rocio's story, since she's the one who all the stuff actually happens to. But I mean, that's part of the whole thing here, right? Child trafficking isn't something that happens to kids, it's something that happens to Tim. Tim is obsessed with narrative fulfillment in a way I don't think I've ever seen in anyone else. To Tim, the destiny of the world has literally been written. And in that destiny, Tim's role is as a sacred warrior. This gives Tim a truly amazing ability to remain unbothered. Rose like a goddamn capybara. After Sound of Freedom started getting a lot of press for how the QAnon world picked it up, Tim's response was that, quote, "Some of these theories have allowed people to open their eyes, so now it's our job to flood the space with real information so that the facts can be shared." The narrative Tim Ballard is convinced he's living through is what allows him to be completely unconcerned with the insane things Jim Caviezel says right next to him. Because anything that doesn't align with the prophecy he has so much literal religious faith in can be dismissed as a plot cul-de-sac, a meaningless departure from the established story structure. At worst, evidence of an interesting character flaw, sure to be resolved during the course of narrative events. Tim's Mormonism is the kind of religion that allows people to think of Donald Trump as an emissary of God, despite Trump saying nothing ever that would indicate a spiritual impulse of any kind. When Tim Ballard presented a screening of Sound of Freedom at Bedminster and interviewed Trump afterward, he and Jim both were apparently completely immune to Trump's obvious indifference.
What was your favorite scene of the film?
I think the start, the ending, and maybe the result was what I liked. That was a great result. That was a hard-earned result, though. The two young children, you have thousands and hundreds of thousands out there. It's so sad to see.
Yeah.
But what's most interesting about Tim to me is how his experiences in the field appear to have broken him in a very essential way, and what that means for his personal narrative. As far as I can tell, the sequence of events in Sound of Freedom are broadly an accurate reflection of what Tim did. He was an agent working on child exploitation cases, and he did quit his job to find a kid after the government told him that the case had fallen out of US jurisdiction and that Tim could no longer count on their support. I think Tim is an extremely traumatized guy. And I think this because he regularly says it.
I thought child sex crimes would be 15-year-olds, 16-year-olds. My brain couldn't comprehend something more evil than abusing that age. The very first case I worked in 2002, I believe, I was given a bunch of VHS videos, some hard drives to look at that had been seized in a warrant. The very first image I saw were there were three little boys. I was so shocked. I fell to my knees. I dry heaved, thinking I was going to throw up into the wastebasket. I jumped into my car. I drove to my children's school, my 3 oldest kids. I checked them out. I still remember in my mind, I can still see dentist appointment I wrote. And I grabbed them. I took them home and just sobbed on the floor. My wife came in and I wouldn't let the kids go. I was just holding them and shaking. That was my very first experience. You talk about PTSD. I absolutely deal with PTSD to this day. I tell people I feel like I've had a million holes burned into my brain because I've watched thousands of hours of that kind of material, not only watching, but writing it in details for the court to see, for the prosecutors to see, and raising children at the same time that are the very same age. And fortunately or unfortunately for me, I have 9 children. At the time, I left the government at 6. And so I can always identify the age of a child with one of my own children. And what my mind was almost automatically doing is I would superimpose my own children's faces and persons onto these children. And that led to the PTSD, I'll be honest, and almost a paranoia about what would happen to my children and watching my children. And
Tim's state of mind is really important to the story of this movie, I think, because he's the figure everyone points to when there's any question about what the people promoting it are trying to accomplish. There's no doubt in my mind that Tim wants to do good. Where he struggles is in his inability to square his theologically informed intentions with the facts of reality.
Like in the beginning, I'd actually go to therapists and I would actually train my mind
oh my gosh.
to like not see my kid.
Block it.
Yeah, to block this or block that. And then I eventually got to the point where I started letting my kid, I was ready to let my kid's face be superimposed. And I actually let it happen. I wanted it to happen because I realized I'm better, I'm more effective if it's my kid, right? And it's personal.
The things he's had to see and do over the course of his career are traumatizing. They're the kinds of horrors that disrupt your expectations of how the world is supposed to work. Unfortunately, he doesn't live in a social circle that's especially prepared to help him process what he's gone through.
Hello, everyone watching and listening.
I watched so much bullshit for this video.
Tim, let's start with you.
Basically, what Tim is doing in this interview is therapy. That's unfortunate for Tim, but very useful for us because we get some great insight into how Tim's mental self-defense mechanisms drive his approach to anti-trafficking. In this interview, Jordan Peterson begins by, of course, pretending that Sound of Freedom is in any way a digression from typical Hollywood portrayals of social issues, because those are the rules you have to play by to retain membership in this clown show.
So I've noticed that one of the most effective ways of communicating complex ideas effectively is to particularize the problem. And so what happens in this movie is that the broad problem of slavery and human trafficking and the somewhat narrower problem of sexual trafficking of children is zeroed, is what focused on a particular case. And so that gives the movie a very powerful narrative underpinning, right? Because when a problem is particularized and you can see how it affects actual specific people's lives, it becomes much more realistic and much more palpable. And I thought the movie did a good job of that.
Dr. Peterson, what you're describing here is a story. Like, that's what stories do. They take issues of the human condition, they localize them to a specific situation. That's the purpose of storytelling. You're describing stories. It's truly amazing what groundbreaking discoveries you can make as a scholar when you've decided that entire fields like literature can be disregarded entirely. You really are at ground zero. I can see why Dr. Peterson is so popular with people like this.
I'm sorry to be so raw, but I feel comfortable with you, Dr. Peterson.
This is the best interview I've ever had in my life.
He then goes on to explain that the way people who have gone through a trauma set their minds right is by coming up with a profound philosophy of good and evil. I agree. I think that's probably true. So then the question is what role Tim occupies in his driving philosophy of good and evil. And in the interview, we land on one through Jim.
I hooked into Tim as a childlike quality to him, and I stay with that innocence. And don't take that innocence as weakness.
All 3 of these men seem to agree with this. Imagining his role as one of childlike humility fits neatly into Tim's theological understanding of himself.
I do try to be a childlike when it comes to my relationship with God. Give the burden to God, and then you can be but you have to subject yourself like a child in order to do that.
Tim is a guy with a small imagination, and because of that, a very inflexible expectation of other people's behavior and the political systems that govern them. The amount of suffering inflicted on the vulnerable is simply too big, too metastasized, to approach with the order and simplicity of a government extraction. His response to this realization, though, is not to turn his mind toward ways we might make the world a place where human trafficking is unthinkable, but to try and force that government extraction model to work by any means necessary. For Tim, violence is the only reasonable solution to child trafficking because violence is the only solution that will personally satisfy the story he's written for himself. He must personally be the one to rescue children from their abusers because that's the only thing that will make his trauma okay. The only thing that will reassure him that his understanding of how the world works was actually right all along.
The only compassionate policy is enforcement.
Yeah.
Watching all the press tours for Sound of Freedom, one of the things I noticed was how much performative disgust they involved.
Yeah, they're like, you can do this.
Oh my gosh.
And
how much would that cost for someone?
Oh, for a kid that young, to have him for the night was around $3,000.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So it's like 3 or 4 times what you would pay for like an adult sex work.
The problem here is not that disgust is an inappropriate response to have to stories about child trafficking. It's that disgust doesn't do anything. The only thing disgust succeeds in is in locating yourself within intolerable and unpredictable conditions. The problem with Tim's ambition to bend reality into the shape of his preferred character arc is that everything that falls outside of that narrative automatically becomes unknowable, unnatural, monstrous.
When we're doing operations, as you see depicted in Sound of Freedom, it's some crazy stuff. We're going into crazy places. We're talking to monsters and demons.
How do moms sell their children?
I don't know, man. It's one of these mysteries I'll never understand.
There is such an intense lack of curiosity among all these people about why child trafficking actually happens. So let's talk about why child trafficking actually happens. Operation Underground Railroad is so named because Tim sees himself as a spiritual successor to slave rescuer Harriet Tubman. Tim really likes to milk this association in press and merch, which has rightfully been a source of criticism from Black rights organizations since OUR's inception. But it's an innocent enough brand, right? OUR is fighting slavery on the ground, person by person, just like Harriet Tubman. I'm a good leftist. I'm all about direct action. And action doesn't get much more direct than physically wresting child slaves out of the hands of their captors. So what's the problem? The problem is that the slavery Harriet Tubman was fighting and the slavery Tim Ballard is fighting are not the same. The difference between chattel slavery and human trafficking is that chattel slavery is sanctioned as a matter of national policy. Human trafficking is a crime in every country. Nowhere on the planet is it legal anymore to outright buy or sell human beings as commodities. That obviously doesn't mean it doesn't happen, but the reason this distinction matters is because a legal and systemized process of buying and selling people is, by definition, systematized, and therefore relatively easy to target compared to the intense personal and sociocultural causes of human trafficking, which have no commonality at all, besides the obvious depravity of people who think they're entitled to the bodies and labor of others. Like, the thing about the Underground Railroad is that it was, underground. It was a secret, and therefore not available for commodification as a brand you could print on your 1840s girl boss pinafore. One of the phrases that becomes very common in discussions about this movie is our children.
Our children.
It's our children.
We have got to protect our children.
At best, this can be understood as a genuinely humanitarian understanding of all children as being everyone's responsibility. But in the context these people are using, I think it means something very different, which is that there's no substantive difference between the conditions of the children of people who get to see Sound of Freedom and children who get trafficked. Like, the family in Sound of Freedom is sort of coded poor, right? I mean, that's certainly how the Wikipedia article about the movie describes them. They're from Honduras, a source country for a lot of the migrants coming over the US-Mexico border right now. They're brown. The dad wears working clothes. There's no mom. But even by American standards, this family is not poor. This house is huge. Each kid has their own room and a parent who cares about and provides for them. It's not that this modeling scam thing never happens. I'm sure it does. But even then, traffickers have to target people they know are unlikely to be investigated, which means the industrial scale of human trafficking we're talking about here is specifically something that happens on the margins of society. People who fall through the cracks.
In somewhere in the region of 1 in 4 to 1 in 6 runaways will end up being trafficked in the US. Because
So it's not like when my grandpa, my oldest aunt, when she was like 6 years old in Idaho, she was like, I am running away from home. And she packs up her bag and walks a quarter mile down the road and sets up a little spot and ran away for a day and then came back. You're not talking. It's not like that anymore.
Not the same.
It's just not the same, and especially if a child finds themselves, we're talking about 60 to 80% of children in the US who are coming from foster care scenario. If they're running away from that, they're running and don't want to be found, maybe.
The kinds of families that kids generally get abducted from are families that have been so churned through the hurricane of war, illness, disaster, and especially poverty that the ability to care for children has itself become a luxury.
You look on an international basis, poverty is such a driver for this. In Southeast Asia, our teams have been out and seen parents have for as little as a kilo of sugar have handed over their child for at the age of 13 for a job in the city, and not realize that that's going to lead them to sexual exploitation, not going to lead themselves to being abused.
The sheer variety of ways people are able to exploit one another, and the specifically underground black market nature of human trafficking is the reason reliable data about it is so hard to get a hold of. This is where on-the-ground ethnographic studies become extremely useful, but tragically overlooked just because it's really, really emotionally hard to get through. For example, in the research I did for this video, Open University professor Heather Montgomery's anthropological fieldwork in the Thai sex trade was more enlightening than any of the statistically based information I found, and I can't describe any of it here, because if I do, honey, I will get booted off this website faster than you can say God's children are not for sale. I'm not even sure I can say most of the titles of her papers about it without demonetization.
There are centuries and centuries of history of families using their children as a way to get out of debt, to get the fathers out of prison. This is really how we saw children being used in this way. So this is not a new thing, but if we can go a bit deeper into the cultural nuances again, in the Buddhist culture in Southeast Asia, the greatest value for females in the family is to be able to provide money to give back to the family. And when I asked the survivors that I was working with directly, what is more honoring? Is it to, or what is less honoring is the way that I phrased it. Is it to say no to your parents and working in the field of sex, or is it to actually not work in the field of prostitution? And they said, it would be much more dishonoring to say no to my parents. And we need to understand
misunderstanding
how
what their parents actually think and their values, but right?
Maybe, and also, there's this concept of socialized exploitation, where the cultural and societal expectation of females and males are different, and people don't even realize sometimes that they've been exploited to provide a certain role in society.
If you were to ask Tim Ballard why human trafficking is a problem, he would tell you different things depending on who you are. If asked by religious ideologues, he says the cause of child trafficking is porn. Not child porn, mind you, just porn. The problem of child sex slavery is 100% the societal consequence of our pornographic world. Pornography is a drug. Adult pornography is marijuana, and child pornography is the cocaine. When people move on to child pornography, eventually they want the real thing. In Less Insane Company, Tim will say that child trafficking happens because it's not a law enforcement priority. Tim likes to break out this statistic that we have 1 agent working on child trafficking for every 5 drug agents. That's probably true. I don't know. If it is, I agree with him. We certainly do, as a society, seem to care more about illegal drug exchanges than the safety of children. But there's another way to frame this fact, which is that child abuse might get 1 agent for every 5 we give to drug trafficking, but they're still getting agents. We do send in law enforcement to #SaveTheChildren. We do it all the time. There's literally a cottage industry on YouTube devoted to entrapping pedophiles and sending the cops in after them. It was an extremely extremely successful network TV show for a while. If there is anything the United States has perfected, it is the application of force to punish crimes both real and invented. The problem with this is not that nobody has thought about it before, it's that it doesn't work. This is why I'm intentionally not talking about the many reports of OUR's various mismanagements. It's not that I don't care Tim Ballard spent untold thousands of dollars trying to chase down a missing child through the advice of a psychic, or that he was ousted from his own organization and the Mormon Church as a whole for alleged sexual harassment, or that he and Angel Studios and everyone associated with this movie have been sued for defamation by the real-life inspiration for Giselle, who it turns out wasn't trafficking children but was trafficked herself, or that OUR has a laughable recruitment program that advertises no experience necessary. It's just that I don't think proving these allegations out is necessary to argue against the strategies they employ, as though the problem with what OUR is doing is a matter of the moral constitution of the people in charge. The problem with OUR is not a matter of leadership, it's a matter of core philosophy. Because even if everything they said were true, even if every operation they conducted was flawless, even if every child they rescued were rehabilitated and released into the world physically, emotionally, and spiritually healed, the result of OUR's work in ending child trafficking would still be abject failure. Their strategy, termed rescue and release, will always fail because it is a strictly reactive policy. Like, let's take OUR's self-reported method of finding child trafficking situations, walking into a bar and asking around to see if anyone has any kids for sale. The problem with this should be pretty apparent. If your goal is to end the purchase and sale of children, one of the easiest and best things you can do is not buy children. The argument here is one of foregone availability. If I don't buy them, someone else will. But there's no reason to believe that's actually the case. At least there's no way for you to personally ensure that that's the case. It may very well be that the kid you end up buying would have been left completely alone but for the demand that you created. The only reason not to expect this is if you believe that all events in reality are specifically engineered to facilitate your personal character growth.
The reason why I stopped doing it is because there were times when I felt like, so one of the ops that we did, I'll be honest, it was the one in Cancun. It was the one that Tim led. These guys, these kids, they were like 22, 23. I don't think they had been trafficking if they had not much. And I remember, they went out and they found these guys, and it took them about 3 days in Cancun to find anybody trafficking somebody. And they finally found these kids. And part of me was like, well, were these guys really trafficking? Because they were young kids. They were kind of idiots. They were like 20, again, they were young 20s. And I remember when they showed up to the party and they had these girls, and I remember thinking to myself, like, did these guys just go round up some girls they know or like whatever and said, come to this party, sleep with these Americans, these rich Americans will pay you or something? And it just never sat right with me. I absolutely think that there was probably a few guys that went out to find girls to bring back because they were trying to get tips from Paul or from Tim or whoever, and they were trying to prove that they were traffickers.
But let's say you're lucky, divinely influenced even. Let's say that every child you find is in the worst possible situation, that they're children for whom the very concept of childhood is foreign, for whom the idea of a choice is something they've never even considered might be a possibility for them, let alone something they have inherently as a human being. Well, if you find such a child, if you get them out of that situation, if you give them the care and support they need over however many years until they're able to re-enter society, then you've done a very good and noble thing. I think Tim Ballard has done good and noble things. In my relatively uninformed opinion, I think there's a place for rescue and release in fighting child trafficking. But even then, structuring our human trafficking response around rescue and release as the flagship strategy will always fail to end human trafficking as a problem because it fails to understand that human trafficking, especially child trafficking, is not an isolated issue. As researcher Angela Duger says, the problem with the rescue and release model is that unless a child in a trafficking situation was kidnapped to meet the demand that you created by looking for children for sale, that child will have gone through multiple human rights violations before they ever came on your radar. This means that rescue and release is a policy that's only useful after multiple horrific crimes have already been committed.
If I was to go into it and say, are there areas that I'd love, like Alan said, movie 2, movie 3 to look further into, I think for me it would be, what are the root causes of what's going on? We have teams of specialist investigators that go out and try and find individuals But what we're finding is around issues of disrupted childhoods, addiction, poverty, that are the precursors to something happening on the ground. And for me, the bit that I would like to see more of is maybe not as much on the kidnap and the locks aspect of it, but more going into the reality of vulnerable youth.
OUR runs on the same kind of logic the American justice system has when it says, sorry, we can only get your abusive ex to stop violating his restraining order if he tries to kill you. Listening to Tim talk about this is so frustrating because he clearly understands that the kinds of kids who get trafficked are culled from situations of societal collapse.
Traffickers seek vulnerability first. And if they find that, that's what they're going to prey upon.
But you will never hear him advocate for any kind of policy that actually addresses the causes of societal collapse. The only policy he's interested in and will actively talk about is, you guessed it, border security. Border security is not an unimportant issue in anti-trafficking. As long as nations are a thing, it's important that people traveling between them are recorded and their identities verified. But the way Tim talks about this is so childish that it becomes almost transcendental.
There was a time when we understood that walls meant security equaled children get rescued. It's very basic, it's very obvious. If you care about kids and you put that first, you're going to agree with the basic concept of 2 + 2 = 4, how border walls and enforcement works to rescue children.
The issue with this is that, as Tim should know, trafficking happens routinely through legal points of entry. That's why there are so many anti-trafficking PSAs in airports. One of Tim's favorite Trump policies was the Remain in Mexico policy, which forces asylum applicants who are only occasionally Mexican to stay in Mexico until their hearing. Hey Tim, what do you think happens to 10-year-old Honduran children forced to live in border towns owned by the cartel while they wait for court dates 2 or 3 years down the line? Tim will not talk about this because the brand of his media presence is focused on how this feels for him to do, how cool it is when missions succeed.
And the miracles are insane.
Each mission he describes has a similar structure of the horror of discovery, the secrecy and intrigue of the infiltration, and finally the immensely cathartic satisfaction of seeing a child trafficker get arrested and a child recovered. Tim has a visceral reaction to any information that marginalizes the power of this narrative.
I don't ever like to get into statistics,
Right.
Because if you go statistics, 6,000 versus literally millions, people say, that's a drop in the bucket, and I just get, because I'm like, you know what? I've done operations before. There was a target in Mexico that we worked on for over a year, this trafficking organization. We could not get in. We'd get this close and then get torn away. And it was one of the operations that I participated on personally, and it was one kid. I went back to my team after that operation and said, I want to show you the bill. This has been over a year. This is how much it cost.
For one kid.
For one kid. I said, did you guys think we would save more than this? Of course, we thought there'd be 20 plus. And I said, was it worth it? Or would you go back and say, we wouldn't do this again? Are you kidding? It's worth it.
There are just some things you can't talk about in polite society. And if OUR is a defender of anything, it's polite society. The fact of the matter is that saving 6,000 children is great. It's awesome. But it is a drop in the bucket. And if you're diverting energy, attention, and resources to an organization whose success by its own admission amounts to a drop in the bucket, then we need to consider whether there might be other options. Most work against human trafficking is extremely unsatisfying. It is not camera ready. It is not narratively compelling. And as far as I can tell, it overall seems to be a profession in which the horror of discovery is mostly sustained forever. Because sometimes you do have to choose between saving one trafficked individual now or many more later.
With every social problem that we seek to solve, we end up creating another problem. Whether that is intended or unintended, there's always a byproduct, right? I shared on a live stream with you guys last week, when we open up international adoption, the number of orphans in a certain country goes up.
Fixing this problem, actually fixing this problem, means giving up countless opportunities to have a compelling personal life story. It often means giving aid to people you don't personally think deserve it. It means setting up safe injection sites and decriminalizing drug use and sex work, and setting up protections for migrants, whether they have papers or not. It means creating conditions so that the kid of a meth addict doesn't end up on the street because their parent died of an overdose, so that someone pimping out a 14-year-old can't tell that child that if he goes to the police, he'll be arrested and deported to a country where being gay is a crime. Ending human trafficking means advocating for labor rights, education rights, anti-discrimination rights, medical rights, housing rights, reproductive rights, divorce rights, religious rights, refugee rights, generally rights for anything that gives people the ability to govern their own lives, and making sure that when those rights are made enforceable, that the people who are actually in these situations know what their rights are and who to go to for help. It means creating a world where people in exploitative situations are in a position to know that what's happening to them is wrong and to have access to a legal system that agrees with them. And if your response is that that sounds like too big a task to be realistic, then I say it's considerably more realistic than expecting to stop child trafficking by intercepting every single pedophile present and future at the point of a gun. When you listen to the spokespeople for Sound of Freedom talk about this, they always stop just short of telling you what their actual policy suggestions are, preferring to leave that part of the conversation tantalizingly up to the imagination. Even Tim will talk about the border, but it's almost like Angel Studios thinks it's an impolite topic. Like when someone announces we need to end child trafficking, it's somehow rude to ask how.
Because until we stop this, until we bring prevention in, all we're doing is going downstream and rescuing people out of the water. We need to go back upstream and find out more about why is this happening.
Yeah, I love this. And I mean, I don't love it.
I mean, in all fairness, they're not saying that only Tim's methods should be advocated for. They're not saying that at all. They're not saying anything. That confused me until I realized that they're leaving the story unfinished for their audience. Like any good movie marketing team, they're sustaining the emotional agitation this movie is meant to inspire. That feeling of aggression, that deep desire to find someone hurting kids and just...
Le voy a meter un palo por el culo. Mi pinche taser. Tengo un taser, tengo un pinche... Le vamos a meter un palo por el culo. We're gonna tase him, we're gonna pepper spray them. Vamos a cortar un dedo. Le vamos a cortar el chile, le vamos a cortar los huevos. We're gonna
This is the source of the truism deployed over and over again by people involved with or otherwise supportive of Sound of Freedom, that this isn't about politics, this is about saving children.
I want to ask all of you, put your politics away.
Let's just put pause in politics. This is about kids, it's not about politics.
Not about politics, not left versus right. It's about child trafficking.
Actually directing that energy towards something concrete would compromise the emotional impact of the movie. It would make it plain that though the component pieces here might be more or less true, what happens in this movie is a story, that it is in some way constructed, and solving child trafficking is actually a really not fun, not satisfying job. The point is not to say that Tim's way is the only way. The point is to say that we should never accept any solution to child trafficking that wouldn't satisfy our anger, that we should never stoop so low as to actually examine the facts of the issues that outrage us in order to solve them, because that would be political, and therefore unamenable to our imagination of a problem so big, so all-consuming in its depravity, that it can only be solved by some kind of specifically violent crusade.
How are we not, I wish that it makes me want to just go undercover and take these people down,
This is the same point James Baldwin made in his essay about Tim's problematic fave, Uncle Tom's Cabin, nearly 70 years ago. Uncle Tom's Cabin is activated by what might be called a theological terror, the terror of damnation, and the spirit that breathes in this book, hot, self-righteous, fearful, is not different from the spirit of medieval times which sought to exorcise evil by burning witches, and is not different from that terror which activates a lynch mob. This panic motivates our cruelty. This fear of the dark makes it impossible that our lives shall be other than superficial. This, interlocked with and feeding our glittering, mechanical, inescapable civilization which has put to death our freedom. It's the encouragement of that impulse to violent action that's important here. For all its cringe, Uncle Tom's Cabin at least has the fairly straightforward moral of we should end slavery. Despite what Tim will tell you, the moral Sound of Freedom was made to send is not we should end slavery. Slavery is illegal. The message here is we should think of solving this crime as a simple matter of the correct application of violence.
A few good men, a few good Marines, and we could do a lot.
The framing of that impulse as a self-evident virtue is the propaganda here. The marketing of this as a protest movie means we are very much meant to identify with Tim in our own lives. But identifying with Tim means expecting a satisfying end to our own unresolved trauma of knowing the horrific things human beings are capable of doing to each other. We are being affirmed in our demand for blood. So, What have we learned from all this? What we're looking at here is a story about hierarchy. I want to return to that interview Monteverde did with the LA Times and ask why it is that Jim Caviezel's insane thoughts are something that Monteverde wants to respect. By the same token, if they care so much about child trafficking, why is it that Tim and the Harmon brothers don't seem to care at all about the misinformation and conspiracies driving the marketing campaign of their movie? The reason is that all of them belong to an ideology where responsibility is only important in so much as it undergirds your personal character arc.
The Bible is alive right now. We're all playing different characters. I got to play Jesus. But some of us are playing Judas.
Looking at Sound of Freedom, its production history, its marketing campaign, and its tearful TikTok reviews and conspiracies all as one big text, the commonality that emerges for me among all these people is that they're all people whose understanding of the world not only allows, but expects them to put any power they might have to effect any actual change in the hands of somebody else. Really, anybody will do, whether it be God or man, because the kinds of conservatives that produced and enthusiastically consumed this movie are people for whom the word freedom means the right to abandon reality. That you should be allowed to say whatever you want about anything, and when whatever you're talking about becomes too difficult to understand, when it requires action that might be inconvenient for you, or doesn't really fit in with the character arc you've got planned for yourself, your responsibility for your own words is over.
And it doesn't matter whether or not it makes sense, or the experts say it makes sense, or whether the bureaucracy's in the way, or whether it doesn't align with what you've done before. As long as you'll step forward in faith, this is how we're going to solve this problem.
Freedom to these people is the right to be as a child, just doing your best to obey. Obedience is a theme that crops up in a lot of these interviews. It's how Jim and Tim specifically get around any accusation that their understanding of human trafficking as being as basic and morally dichotomous as a child's superhero movie might not be helpful, and in fact might be detrimental. They're just fulfilling their role in a grander design. What happens after they do their thing is neither their concern nor their responsibility.
God doesn't always choose the best, but he chose me, so what am I going to do about it?
And I think the misunderstanding of this worldview is what resulted in the total misfire of mainstream think pieces about Sound of Freedom, because the term propaganda suggests a claim to power. It suggests a unified intentionality of everybody involved. But I don't think that these people wake up excited to make the world a more difficult place to be poor and disadvantaged. I think they wake up excited to serve.
I mean, what did Jesus teach? That's all he taught. Serve, 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 serve.
This movie is a tale told by proud idiots, full of sound and fury and signifying nothing except the comfort granted by relinquishing power to political candidates who routinely display their disdain for freedom, for whom the only rights worth defending are those of arbitrary authority figures, namely churches, bosses, and cops, to tell you what to do. That's clearly what Eduardo Verástegui is looking forward to, should his presidential campaign succeed. In my opinion, what we're in right now is what's known in certain anthropological circles as a heroic society. That's not a compliment. A heroic society is a murder everyone in your household who even thought about hitting on your wife while you were out having adventures for 20 years kind of place, you know? A behead all the losers of this ball game type beat. It's a civilization in which the legitimacy of authority is founded on big spectacular contests and boastful shows of wealth and generosity and sacrifice, and the kinds of governments they produce are expressly authoritarian. A heroic society runs on nothing so much as symbols. Symbols and the promises those symbols are meant to represent. Tim Ballard and OUR and Eduardo Verástegui and the Harmon brothers and Jim Caviezel and their chosen king Donald Trump are promising us that if we just trust that they are divinely guided to enact God's destiny for America, everything will be fine. What they're offering us as proof of this is a series of highly public and dramatic ceremonies that symbolize thought. That's what social media is, a place where you can perform the act of thinking without actually retaining any thoughts at all. That's the reason it feels like everyone's getting stupider. Because our dominant communication system is one that equates attention with authentic emotion and authentic emotion with objective fact, while simultaneously telling us the exact opposite, that this technology is obviously evidence not of our erosion of reason or thoughtfulness, but of our innovative genius and clear eye toward the future, an unmistakable step on the road of human evolution toward our inevitable Chrome utopia. It is not possible in this ideology of the internet for the internet to cause social disturbances, only to reveal conflicts, that we may resolve them with transparency. The best disinfectant is sunlight, after all. I reject this idea. If, as Stafford Beers says, the purpose of a system is what it does, then the purpose of social media is to build superficial credibility for humanity's most batshit ideas. Only this communication system could allow people like Russell Brand to frame a group of people openly trying to establish a conservative theocracy as some kind of punk nonconformist. He's the kind of person for whom no statement is ever too insane to be publicized, because the existence of insane shit is just evidence of the innate democracy of social media at work. But man, you know, we're not in the future. What we're witnessing is the same thing that's happened in thousands of human societies in the past. The breakdown of one system of authority as another one rises. Just because humans carry around pieces of metal and glass to spit our stupid thoughts into doesn't mean we've graduated past basic human social incentives. So no, Russell Brand, to the extent that people don't like Sound of Freedom, it's not because of its economic disruption or its subject matter. It's because it's being used to advocate for a system with more surveillance, more coercion, more violence, more waste, where the leader, when asked his favorite part of his ideology's cultural event of the year, can get away with saying,
I think the start, the ending, and maybe the result.
Where the height of intellectual engagement is watching Jordan Peterson discover the concept of a story. What these people are offering is a system that is openly against the values of critical thought and self-governance, that has no interest either in preventing vulnerability or helping those affected by it unless there's an immediate individual benefit to someone's social status. Like, sure, kid, your situation is pretty awful, but what can you do for me? What can you do for the salvation of my eternal soul? For the glory of my name? Come back when you've been sold into slavery. It's a system that requires, more than anything, a population sick of the messy reality of compromise and self-determination, and ready to believe that what society is really missing is a live-action role play of a really good drama, some really fire content. That's what's going to fix us. And that's what we have right now, a population of people whose primary source of information keeps them stuck perpetually at the tippy top of a roller coaster and ready for something to break the suspense, for someone to tell them what happens next. And finally, the heroes are emerging, and the rest of the narrative becomes clear. This guy just might pull it off. He really might end child trafficking at the point of a gun, might make America great again, might hammer the world into the shape we see in all our culture's great tales. After all, we all know how this story goes, and life is just like the stories. Otherwise, why would we tell them? Sure, things look grim now, but it's just the dark night of the soul, right before we're finally vindicated. We're in the climax of the legend of all humanity right now. All we have to do is follow our hero's example and we'll be led to our ultimate reward. All this suffering will end and everything will be put right again. Our paranoia justified, our anguish avenged, all of it will happen any day now. 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 Thanks again to Surfshark for sponsoring this video. Remember to use code MORBIDZOO for an extra 3 months on your subscription, all for free. Was that good? Was that a natural integration? God, I can't see shit anymore.